This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, and this is episode 716 of the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, sponsored by FanDuel. Thanks for tuning in. I know a lot of trade deadlines, they've now passed. So a lot of you are probably thinking, this 15 transactions episode doesn't help me nearly as much as it did a week or two ago. And you're probably not wrong. It's not as effective of a list when you can't actually buy and sell players. But I say this every year, confidence matters. Knowing the direction a player is trending, that can be helpful when you're constructing your lineups each week. So when I say a player is a sell, it can also mean, hey, you may need to make up some points in your lineup because this guy's trending in the wrong direction. Or this guy won't maintain his current pace. And then the opposite side is true too. As we approach the end of the fantasy season, I will begin to feature more adds and drops than buys and sells on this show. Because that's what's more useful for you. But do be aware that buys and sells are still relevant this time of year. They just take on a new meaning. Now, before getting to the list of transactions this week, as most of you know, basketball season is going strong, which means Wednesday nights are jam-packed with NBA action. And FanDuel and Buzzer plan on giving you a chance to win big with their daily fantasy basketball contest. Introducing the NBA Clutch Shot presented by Buzzer, an NBA DFS contest taking place every Wednesday from now until March that gives you a chance to win a share of FanDuel's biggest prize pool. Simply construct your best 9-player roster while staying under the salary cap and follow along as the games unfold using FanDuel's live scoring feature. Earn points for points scored, rebounds, assists, steals, and blocks, and watch as your lineup climbs the ranks. The higher up the leaderboard your lineup finishes, the more cash you'll win. It's that simple. The contest is live, so visit fanduel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1 and submit your lineups now. That's fanduel.com/league/NBA-main-marquee-1. Hold DJ Moore. So after 3 straight games of fewer than 7 PPR points, DJ Moore had a big game. He had 4 catches and 103 yards and a touchdown against the Broncos on Sunday. And that performance happened to come with a new quarterback under center, Sam Darnold. Now, I will say this. It's likely the connection between Darnold and Moore is better than Moore and any other quarterback on that roster. But we can't expect Moore to account for 63% of his team's receiving yards each and every week. And what makes it even worse for DJ Moore is that the Panthers still have their bye. So that's not great. But with that being said, I do think he's a hold instead of a sell. I don't think you necessarily have to sell high off this performance. Because when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to wide receivers, the Panthers have the second most favorable schedule during weeks 15 through 17, the fantasy playoffs. They get the Steelers, Lions, and Buccaneers, who all rank as top 10 favorable matchups against wide receivers. We know DJ Moore is a talented wide receiver. It's very possible that he is productive during the fantasy playoffs. Sell Latavius Murray. So this is courtesy of my friend Field Yates over at ESPN. He had tweeted that the Broncos are currently averaging the lowest points per game output since the 2000 Cleveland Browns. We know that the Broncos offense is pitiful, and that's impacting every single player in that offense. Courtland Sutton has consistently been seeing 25% target shares, but he doesn't have that much of a ceiling because he can't find the end zone. And you can make that exact same argument for someone like Latavius Murray. But to me, there's even more to Murray's story. In Week 12 was the first game without Melvin Gordon. Murray saw really good usage. He had 87% of Denver's running back rushes. Now, he only saw 1 target for a 3% target share, but he ran 25 routes. That was significantly more than Marlon Mack's 3. The issue that I have with Murray, aside from the offense, aside from the situation, is that Mike Boone could return this week. Earlier in the season when Boone was healthy, he was handling pass catching work. And given the Broncos' struggles, that's not a horrible role because they're going to often be in negative game scripts. So this recommendation is basically saying that Latavius Murray might not keep up this workload. It's possible it continues, but I think if Mike Boone is healthy, he's going to dig into that a lot, especially the receiving side. Add Zonovan Knight. So James Robinson was a surprise inactive for the Jets in Week 12. And that led to a backfield trio of Michael Carter, Ty Johnson, and Bam Knight, Zonovan Knight. Carter then hurt his ankle in that game against Chicago. Knight ended up playing 49% of New York's offensive snaps. that doubled Ty Johnson's snap count. Knight had a 56% running back rush share, and he had a really good 10.7% target share. He's not a bad receiver. Now, at the time of this recording, I don't know how long Michael Carter's going to be sidelined, but Knight is intriguing. You should be adding him this week, especially because the Jets have one of the most favorable schedules down the stretch for running backs. Buy Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry might win some fantasy leagues this year. I know that's super shocking to hear. But I'm bringing up Henry because he's only had one Derrick Henry type game over his last 3. He scored just 8.7 PPR points back in week 10 against Denver. He then had a monster performance against the Packers, and then this past week, he didn't hit 15 PPR points. I'm sitting here on this show right now telling you to not even remotely panic. According to my adjusted fantasy points allowed numbers, Tennessee has the 3rd best fantasy playoff schedule for running backs. They get the Chargers and the Texans in weeks 15 and 16. Those are 2 top 5 matchups. And then they get Dallas in week 17. The only thing stopping Derrick Henry more than likely is an injury. And you can say that exact same thing for any running back. Sell Brian Robinson. Atlanta's now allowed an RB1 performance in each of their last 6 games. That includes 2 games to Deontay Foreman and now 1 to Brian Robinson. They're a top 10 matchup in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs, and they've gotten worse and worse as the year's gone on. But I will say, Robinson had good peripherals against those Falcons on Sunday. After Antonio Gibson hit his highest snap share of the season in week 11, Robinson leapfrogged him in week 12. He played 6 more snaps. And Robinson also finished the day with his highest target share of the season at 13.6%. So everything looked good on paper for Brian Robinson in week 12. But the problem is, it's Atlanta. And given the evidence that we have, this does not seem all that sustainable. Robinson's failed to see a target in 5 of 8 games this year. And Washington only has 1+ matchup through the end of the fantasy season in adjusted fantasy points allowed to running backs. And they also still have their bye. That makes Robinson even less attractive. I think we should still be prioritizing Antonio Gibson over Brian Robinson rest of season. Add Isaiah McKenzie. It's been a really weird year for Isaiah McKenzie. At one point this season, we thought that Khalil Shakir might be taking that slot role in Buffalo, but he's bounced back. On Thanksgiving, he was really, really good. He scored 22.3 PPR points against the Lions. And it wasn't just that fantasy total that looked good. He had a 25.6% target share when his previous season high was 8 percentage points lower. And he also played a snap share of 73%. That was his highest of the 2022 season. So adding Isaiah McKenzie this week makes plenty of sense. Sell James Conner. So I had Conner as a buy on this 15 transaction show just a few weeks ago. And since then, he's had 2 top 5 performances in 3 games. It's nice to see that I don't get everything wrong. But I'm prefacing with that because it's important that you know that I'm not sitting on the show today saying that Conner played really well in week 12, therefore you have to just sell him. Clearly, I'm into James Conner and his workload. I don't know how you can't be. During his 3-game stretch, he's handled roughly 87% of Arizona's running back rushes. He's had a target share per game above 10%. This is about expectations moving forward. And let's be honest, it's hard to find running backs who are seeing the usage that James Conner is seeing. But it's also tough to find running backs with a harder schedule than James Conner has moving forward. Conner has 1+ matchup through the end of the fantasy season, and it comes in week 17. The Cardinals have a bye this week. That's not good for Conner's overall value. And then they get New England, a team that ranks as the toughest matchup against running backs in adjusted fantasy points allowed. And then it's Denver and Tampa Bay. Those are 2 bottom 5 matchups. Conner can get by on volume, but this has a chance to be a rough month before a cakewalk matchup in the fantasy championship against Atlanta. Add Zay Jones. So I was just patting myself on the back for saying to buy James Conner before he blew up and did really well over that 3-game stretch. I'm going to do the opposite with Zay Jones. I've talked about Zay Jones so many times this year on my sleeper show, but I didn't talk about him last week, and that's a big L. I should have been on him because last week in week 12, he was amazing. He had a 37.8% target share in that game against Baltimore. He's now had back-to-back games with a 25% share, and he's up to a 21.3% target share across the entire season. It's why I've been bringing him up so much on that sleeper show, because his peripherals have actually been really good all year long. And then this week, the Jags get the Lions in what could be a shootout. The early over-under, according to FanDuel Sportsbook, is 51.5 points. So at the very least, Zay Jones could definitely serve as a spot start for your fantasy team this week. But I do want to say one thing. Jacksonville has a pretty brutal wide receiver schedule in the fantasy playoffs. They get the Cowboys, Jets, and Texans. Those are 3 rough matchups and adjusted fantasy points allowed. Their next 2 games are against Detroit and Tennessee. He should be fine there. But temper expectations as you get to the most important part of your fantasy season. Add JaMychal Hasty and Darrell Henderson. So the Jags claimed Darrell Henderson this past week, but he was a healthy scratch in week 12. He wasn't ready to suit up after just joining the team. And of course, the game that Jacksonville played after getting Henderson, Travis Etienne gets injured. He left Sunday's contest early with a foot injury. Now, I know what a lot of you guys are thinking. It's not a serious injury, and it's not. And he was evidently cleared to play against Baltimore, but the Jags were just cautious with it, which makes total sense. But we know how this goes sometimes. If you remember just a couple of weeks ago with Leonard Fournette, I talked about this very same thing. There was a report from Adam Schefter saying that Fournette would be fine after their bye week, and he was not fine. Rachaad White this past week was the bell cow in that offense without Leonard Fournette. In Travis Etienne's absence this past week, JaMychal Hasty really stepped up. He saw 71% of Jacksonville's running back rushes, and he played the vast majority of their offensive snaps. And he also had a 13.5% target share. Now, last week, I would have said that Henderson was the clear-cut handcuff to Travis Etienne after they got him. But after this performance, I think it seems reasonable to think that Hasty would be sort of the 1A in that backfield if Travis Etienne misses any time. At the very least, Hasty would be the primary pass catcher. But I do think that Henderson can be added too. It's just that if you're only looking for week 13 and not beyond, I think Hasty is the guy that I would prefer over Henderson. Sell Adam Thielen. So I don't think Adam Thielen's big Thanksgiving outing is a sign of what's to come. Last Thursday, he scored 21 PPR points and he had a 27% target share. Those were both season highs. And this comes with TJ Hawkinson being active for the Vikings. Since Hawkinson arrived, things have not been that good for Adam Thielen. During Thielen's 3 games prior to week 12, he averaged a target share per game of just 14%. Before TJ Hawkinson entered the picture, that number was 21%. Until Thanksgiving, he had failed to reach double-digit PPR points in every single game with Hawkinson by his side. And Minnesota only has 1+ matchup for wide receivers by adjusted fantasy points allowed through the end of the year. So I would be very surprised if Adam Thielen is all of a sudden a reliable fantasy asset for you. Add Mike White. So I highly doubt that Mike White is a no-doubt starter for your fantasy team from here on out. But there is some good to his profile. He's now finished as a high-end QB1 in 2 of his 4 NFL starts. He has a really good supporting cast. And while his Week 12 matchup against Chicago was a really, really good one, Chicago's defense is playing like hot garbage, we can't ignore the fact that the Jets get the Vikings, Bills, Lions, Jags, and Seahawks through the end of the fantasy season. Only the Bills among that group is a tough opponent to quarterbacks and adjusted fantasy points allowed. Not all leagues have really good quarterback streamers just sitting on the waiver wire. So you can look at Mike White. Add Tyler Conklin. And with Mike White under center, we can feel a little bit more optimistic about the pass catchers on that team. A lot of people are going to talk up Elijah Moore, maybe Corey Davis too. I'm interested in Tyler Conklin. He ran just 1 fewer route than Davis this past week in a positive game script. There's nothing wrong with Corey Davis and Elijah Moore. I'm just making note of Conklin, who's sort of flying under the radar. He's averaged a target share per game of almost 18% over his last 5. He hasn't been that productive, but the peripherals are at least there. He's a decent add, though, overall, because he had good usage this past week, the quarterback changes there, and the schedule is great. In fact, New York has the best tight end schedule through week 17 when looking at adjusted fantasy points allowed to tight ends. Tight end is a huge issue for fantasy teams across fantasy football. So taking a chance on Tyler Conklin makes some sense. Add Ty Davis-Price. So the 49ers backfield is kind of a mess right now. It was announced on Monday that Elijah Mitchell sprained his MCL again. He's going to miss 6 to 8 weeks once again. And then all the while, Christian McCaffrey, he's having knee irritation. That's being managed day to day. That could explain his slightly lower backfield share in week 12. Now on Sunday, Jordan Mason was the other running back who was active for San Francisco. He got a little bit of run. but he was active more than likely because he's a special teamer. He's playing over Ty Davis-Price as a result of that. But he did look good against New Orleans. Mason finished the day with an 80% success rate. That's really good. So the question is, where do we go from here? What's going to happen? And the answer is, no one really knows. But let's at least be logical here. I would prioritize Ty Davis-Price off the wire. We saw him play ahead of Mason back in week 2 when Mitchell was out and both of those running backs were active. That's when Jeff Wilson was still on the team. Davis-Price was then injured, and that derailed any momentum that he was sort of building. But this could honestly go in a lot of directions. It's Kyle Shanahan after all. Tevin Coleman's even an option off the practice squad. I'm just going to go with the player who has the most intriguing profile, and he's one who would hypothetically complement Christian McCaffrey really well, given his size-speed combo. Add the Seattle Seahawks defense. The Seahawks look pretty pathetic in Week 12, but the good news is that they face the Rams and the Panthers over their next 2 games. Those are 2 top 10 matchups for fantasy defenses. But I get it, you might not want to go Seattle's way. They did not look good this past week. If you'd rather play it week by week, you could get a defense like Cleveland who gets Houston this week, or the Giants who get the Commanders. It's totally reasonable to go that route. I just know that fantasy managers like to look ahead. And Seattle has a nice 2-week schedule upcoming. You just have to hope that they show up more than they did in Week 12. Buy the Kansas City Chiefs defense. You could also go out and trade for a defense too if your trade deadline has not passed. And if you're thinking about doing something like that, Kansas City makes some sense right now. Now, the first thing to note is that Kansas City gets Cincinnati this week. There's a chance that throughout your leagues, they get dropped because people won't want to play them against Cincinnati. So watch out for that. If Kansas City gets dropped, you're going to want to scoop them up. They finish as a top 12 defense in weekly scoring in 3 straight games and 4 of their last 5. And their schedule after Cincinnati is unbelievable. After week 13, they have matchup against the Broncos, who are the 5th best matchup for defenses in adjusted fantasy points allowed, the Texans, who are the 3rd best, the Seahawks, who are the 14th best, and then the Broncos once again. And that game against Seattle that I just mentioned, that's being played in Kansas City. So they'll probably be a top 10 option that week. You're going to want to be a week ahead with this one. Because let's say that someone drops Kansas City this week. And then next week, everyone's going to look at which defense to add off the wire. And they're going to see the Chiefs playing the Broncos. That means that someone's going to prioritize them, probably without even realizing how good their schedule is from here on out. So this is the week to get the Kansas City Chiefs defense. Some of you might remember that I used to feature a 16th transaction on this show each week, and I dropped that feature here in 2022. Well, after doing my work on Monday for Tuesday's show, the 15 transaction show, news broke that Melvin Gordon was signing with the Chiefs. And instead of removing one of the transactions, I figured it would be more beneficial to just make a 16th one. And it's to add Melvin Gordon. We probably shouldn't expect Gordon to just become the team's lead back outright. But it's at least in the range of outcomes here. Rookie Isaiah Pacheco has been very solid, especially when you consider that he was a 7th round selection in the NFL draft. He has a success rate according to NumberFire's expected points model above 45%. That's 10 percentage points higher than teammate Jerick McKinnon. And it's also 10 percentage points higher than Melvin Gordon. But Pacheco has not been a pass catcher. That's limited him. He's seen just 1 target over his last 3 games. And those are 3 games where he started to capture a larger backfield share. That could be Melvin Gordon's in within this offense. And that's a little bit scary for Isaiah Pacheco. Chances are we're still staring at a committee in Kansas City. I think Pacheco is still going to see the most early down work. And considering Gordon's fumbling issues, it would be somewhat surprising if Gordon saw goal line work. But in fantasy football, you have to be open-minded. Fantasy football forecasting is not about singling out one projection and just going with it, and just running with that projection. It's about understanding the range of outcomes. And if Kansas City wants a veteran running back like Melvin Gordon running the show, they can make it happen. They can throw him on the field. It's as simple as that. So I don't think this is going to completely derail Isaiah Pacheco, but we should be open-minded to the fact that it could. If Kansas City wants that to happen, they're going to make that happen. Add Jaylen Warren. So for the first time in 15 transactions history, we've got a 17th transaction. And it's because there's madness going on across the league. In Monday night's game against the Colts, Najee Harris was ruled out in the early parts of the third quarter with an abdominal injury. The problem is that backup Jaylen Warren was inactive for that game. He's had a hamstring issue. So unfortunately, we weren't able to see Jaylen Warren as a bell cow in the Steelers' offense. Now, Mike Tomlin did say that Warren's hamstring injury was not significant. So there's some hope for Week 13 if Najee Harris isn't able to go. But at the time of this recording, I have no idea who's in or who's out. What I do know is the Steelers get the Falcons this week. Whoever's in could have a nice fantasy outing. That's why Jaylen Warren needs to be added. That's it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Fantasy Football Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter @LateRoundQB. Remember to check out LateRound.com. Join the Patreon to get access to rest of season rankings, weekly rankings and tiers, and an awesome Discord community. I can't even explain how awesome the Discord is, for real, especially on game days. You get access to that Discord when you're part of the Insider tier over on Patreon. So check it all out, LateRound.com. Thanks for listening, everyone. I'll talk to you tomorrow.